Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Artists and their chosen form of expression is seen to be essential for the cultural development of any society. But when we try to break it down, how much influence do artists have in changing the course of history and impacting politics? And what are the consequences of mixing art with activism? Let's discuss this further with our guest. Joining us today is Zorach, who's the professor of art history at Northwestern University, author of Art for People's Sake, Artists and Community in Black Chicago. She joins us from Chicago. Also joining us today is Shannon Galpin, who's the author of the photography book, Streets of Afghanistan, and an activist and an artist. Joining us from Colorado. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Glad to have you both here with us. Shannon, let me begin with you. Now, when we're starting this conversation, talking about how much impact art actually has on politics, let me begin from a different point of discussion. Can art ever be apolitical?
Been revolutionary, and it's affected so many social justice movements through history. I don't think this is something that is new. I think this goes back, since kind of the beginning of art. We just don't always see it in that context. And we see this through more recent social justice movements, as immediate as climate justice movements now, but it goes back through the civil rights movement. It goes back through kind of the more revolutions that we've had. And I think certainly Rebecca can speak to this through art history. But we've seen this with Banksy, especially looking at graffiti and stencil art on the West Bank wall and how that's affected the ability to have voice. And I think that's where we see the power of art in public space in particular.
Right. As Shannon mentioned here, the power of art isn't something new. It's not a new idea. It's existed for as early as we know, as early as the first art was found on cave walls. But when we're discussing this, how do you think art has changed? Now we have a plethora of visual mediums. How do you think the power of art has changed today?
If you look back over the course of history, much of the art that we understand as part of art history now was the product of people in power, and what's survived to the present day. A lot of it, is commissioned by very powerful people, kings and rulers, and people vying for authority on the world stage. But at the same time, there was artwork being produced by people in, people's movements and popular crafts and all kinds of things that we don't necessarily have access to historically, but we can see now artwork, and different kinds of creative activities being done by people all over the world. So I think the creative potential for art to make political change is something that's, I think, more evident to us today, although it was always present. But I think also, people have found really ingenious ways to get their ideas across in protest movements through digital means. In particular, something that's obviously a new technology. People have always been trying to get their ideas out into the world, but there's much greater capacity for people to do that now.
Right, and when you mention that there's greater capacity that now, the accessibility of art, for everyone being able to understand it, for everyone being able to reach it, not just it being confined to museums or selective places, do you feel like that has also changed? That barrier has been broken?
I think I think it's something there's greater access to and greater visibility now. I think for millennia, people have been making art and seeing art in public spaces. But I think that there are some barriers that have been broken. I think there's still also a lot of repression of people's ideas and people's art. But I think there are. If you think about just like cell phone cameras and how many people have access.
Rebecca, that's an interesting point. I want to jump back to Shannon and talk to her a little about her work as an artist. Now, Shannon, you have had many social justice projects which have been influenced by art, which you have also expressed your own activism through art. Why did you choose this medium specifically? What does it mean to you?
I love using the public space and I love street art. And a lot of what I do is using multimedia in the public space. So I don't necessarily use spray can art. A lot of what I'm doing often is using, I did a ribbon project in Paris, which is around memories, because I'd had a brain injury and had lost my memories. And so I hung my memories around Paris. I do a lot of wheat paste murals, which I've done around climate justice movement with my daughter, which was life-size extinction murals around endangered species, along with a Mexican artist, Diana Garcia. And that was done as a collaboration to bring extinction and biodiversity conversations into urban spaces, which don't always have the same discussions. And I think that there's an ability often to bring a different medium into public space, because it's essentially an outdoor museum often. And there's kind of a more acceptance now of using public space for art.
Right. And just to refer to one of your projects, which is Love Letters, let's take a look at it. And can you describe for us exactly what was going through your mind when you created this project, and what impact did you feel like it had in society?
The Love Letter project is specifically around a stalking and harassment project. I had a stalker for 3 years. The stalker sent me these love letters scrawled on the back of pieces of art and other things that he sent me in the mail. And I recreated them as ransom note, kind of kidnapper style, cut and paste. And I have done a series of murals in multiple cities to highlight this crime of stalking and harassment, and bringing this very prevalent crime that is often not discussed and that kind of has a black hole in the justice system into the public space, and creating a conversation around it for women has been incredibly empowering. Women have hugged me in the streets, men have hugged me in the streets, and thanked me for bringing this discussion into a public space so that we can kind of shine a light on it.
Right, and it indeed is a very, very interesting project to look into, and the work that you've done. Rebecca, that point that there are many black holes which aren't talked about, and art is a way of doing that. How has art historically, and how do you feel like it does so now, especially in terms of minority rights and oppressed groups, help give a voice to the voiceless?
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that people have used art for political means is through protest art and art that's used in street protest. Mm-hmm. So not only I'm very much interested in public art and kind of graffiti and street art, but also all the ways that protesters actually use props and imagery in protest to get their points across. And this has been used certainly in the civil rights movement, as Shannon mentioned, and I've looked a lot at the Black arts movement. So artists in Chicago who were part of the Black liberation struggle, who used art to kind of circulate ideas and to speak to their own community, to kind of create a sense of identity and a sense of shared struggle, and also to speak to those in power to kind of get their ideas across. Most recently in Chicago, I think one of the most interesting groups has been groups interested in closing down particular prisons that are especially oppressive, that are part of the prison industrial complex, or getting reparations for police torture in Chicago, and using art projects that began really as kind of just sort of an effort at getting to know prisoners and understand their struggles, that kind of blossomed into work that really changed the course of history. So actually getting the city of Chicago to pass a reparations bill for people who were victims of police torture through the means of art, that artists who worked together with activists who had been struggling for a long time and having difficulty getting across, until artists came along and helped to translate that into visual media that a lot of people could become, to really be moved by, and to start to see the importance of developing a reparations process for people who had been really deeply harmed by the
Right. Rebecca, now something that you said here is very, very interesting, which is, of course, helping getting their point across, translating something that in many ways might be a combination of intangible feelings, might be complex ideas which can't get through to many people. What's exactly unique about art which lets you translate something so intangible in a way that can be understood by many? And is there a risk of it being misconstrued? Now, this is, of course, a question I'd like Rebecca and Shannon both to give their take on.
Well, I think that, I'm thinking of an art exhibition that was held by the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials group, where people who had been tortured by a particular group within the Chicago police signed their names on a wall, and it was a kind of an art installation that grew to include many signatures. And that is just a little bit different from a kind of testimony that you would hear in a courtroom or a newspaper article. That physical act of signing the name on the wall and then seeing that list of signatures grow has this kind of emotional, as you were saying, emotional impact that's just different. It's not necessarily better or more effective. It's just differently effective and kind of allowed for people to engage with the idea and to kind of come to a reckoning with this history in a different way. Right.
Shannon, now the beauty of art is its fluidity, but as I was talking to Rebecca about this, is there a chance for this fluidity to be misconstrued and the intention of the artist to be misconstrued? Do you feel like as an artist you face that conundrum?
Oh, I think always. I mean, the beauty of art is that it transcends language. You don't need to have a language. You don't want to have it completely laid out and described for the viewer. But obviously it means it's open for interpretation. It's why when you walk into a major museum like the Louvre, you often don't understand something that's happened centuries ago. It can seem very boring, but it also means that when you do something that's quite provocative, it can be completely misconstrued and you often don't understand what's happening. And I think that that's the risk, but it's also the beauty.
Right. And you've worked a long time in Afghanistan with street art specifically. How do you think in a context such as that, which of course has been marred by conflict, by many other social and economic troubles, did art play a role to start a conversation or create impact?
I think in Afghanistan in particular, it was incredibly important to work with young artists that had not worked in public art before, that never used graffiti. It was a situation where public art was new in Afghanistan, which also meant that it was not illegal because it never had been used in the public sphere before. But young Afghans had not felt like they had a voice in politics, in the public sphere, and it was a way in which they could use art to have a voice and feel like they could be heard, whether that was around women's rights or corruption, politics. And there's an incredible movement with warlords and other groups that are using art now to have a voice and feel like they can be heard in their own country.
Right. Rebecca, now politics is catching up to this realization that people who don't feel like they have a voice, they express very complicated, very dark opinions, which are, of course, reflective of history through art. Do you feel like with the political polarization we're seeing all across the world, art, and especially activist art, is under threat?
I certainly think that there's a threat of censorship. I mean, a lot of the artworks that I've studied have been things that were done illegally. As Shannon was alluding to the fact that street art wasn't necessarily illegal yet in Afghanistan, but in various places it is. We've seen lots of situations where artworks have been removed or covered up, or are just too challenging to the powers that be. I think, and a lot of the things that artists do, political artists in particular, get categorized as criminal acts as opposed to artworks.
On that point, thank you so much, Rebecca, Zorach, for joining us from Chicago. Shannon, just as we're talking about all of this, the fact that there might be an increase in censorship, we know that in many ways, governments do want to control the narrative more and more. Do you feel that as well, that art is, and the artistic voices are trying to be stifled?
Oh, definitely. It's hard to control the beauty of art in public space. It means that you can't control it, and it means that it's a threat to governments, to large scale corporations, to anyone that wants to manipulate and control a certain narrative. And so you definitely see artists that are under threat, artists that that are threatened and that are trying to be stifled. And many places in the world, public art is very dangerous. And artists cannot have their faces uncovered. Like, I am lucky to operate, with pretty open autonomy. And the art that I do is provocative, but not dangerous. But many artists cannot, appear on TV like this with their faces uncovered, because the art that they're doing is challenging to their government.
Right, and when you say dangers to artists, can you expand upon that a little more, just so we get a perspective of the risk many people put their lives in, their livelihoods in trying to express their opinion or express what they think is right or wrong?
I think, like any dissident or any political activist, if you are acting as a political activist and you are expressing your opinion in a public sphere, and you're willing to do that with your art in terms of graffiti, one, if you're operating in a place in which the public art and graffiti art is illegal, that's already a risk. But if you're also expressing views that are against an authoritarian government, then obviously that's a secondary risk. And you're doing it in using an art form in which it takes time to install that art on the wall.
Right. Thank you so much, Shannon Galpin, for joining us from Colorado and taking out the time to talk to us. Joining us now is Rozan, Ahmed, who's the founder of the Magic Drive, which works to change the face of poverty, and was also selected as the cultural ambassador from the Sudan government. She joins us from London. Thank you so much, Rozan, for joining us, and welcome to this show. Now, you might have heard the last bit of conversation we were having with Shannon about the dangers of being an artist, especially when you're very politically active. Now, of course, art is a form of creativity. Do you feel like there are downsides when an artist becomes too politically active?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's, in fact, a responsibility of artists to reflect the times, good or bad. I actually think it's really difficult for an artist to not do that, to not reflect their scenario, their environment, and the conditions in which they and their people are living in. I wouldn't know how one could be an artist otherwise.
Right. You make a strong point talking about how you don't know any other way of an artist to, of course, express themselves. But we see all across the world many criticism. India, of course, if we take that as a case, being the latest example of many critique coming in to Bollywood stars, to many artists who aren't speaking up about the political times. Do you feel like there are reasons for when artists aren't coming to the forefront of political change or political debate?
Yes. That's a very good question. We all know how powerful art is, not only when it comes to our hearts and our emotional functionality, but also how important it is to our psyches, how we perceive, how we're seen, and also how we see. So it's a tool in many ways, and those in powerful positions and places around the world have realized art's capability to shift consensus or influence societal thinking, and that tool has been manipulated, and we have to admit that. It's been used as a tool for propaganda, or it's been used strictly as this form of nothing but entertainment. It's been used as a tool for distraction. So we are aware that art is a tool, and it has been used badly and it has been used brilliantly. So it's really up to us as artists, as activists, as individuals who feel a sense of responsibility to use that tool wisely or not.
Right. Rozan, stay with me on that point. Also joining us is Dr. Rehman, who's the Associate Professor of Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences and the band leader of Lal. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you so much, Dr. Rehman, for joining us. Now, when we're talking about art being used as a tool, how destructive can that be? In fact, Rozan pointed out to different ways as how it is being used, how it has been used, but just to understand the gravity of that.
Well, I'd refer to the Nazi art of the 1930s, which glorified imperialism, glorified war, glorified patriarchy, and attempted to, and did manage, in fact, to move an entire nation, in fact, an entire continent, towards declaring an imperialist war against its neighbors, expanding its territory, which led to the loss of 50 million European and non-European lives. So while art does not bear the sole responsibility in World War II or the consequences of fascism, fascist art does share in the responsibility of the death and destruction caused by the fascist political movement.
Right. And when we're talking about this and just shifting a little the conversation, we've been talking about art being used as a tool, also talking about the power of art and the sensitivities that one must observe, especially as an artist. You, of course, you, of course, represent the culture being represented through art. What sensitivities do you feel like you have to watch out for as an artist?
It's very difficult, I feel, to be an artist and be entirely considerate of every person that may come across your work, right? So I don't think it's easy to be very, very sensitive and do your job as an artist. At the same time, however, there's an empathy, I believe, in creating art that will immediately create baseline sensitivities. If you are an artist and you are projecting the times, then a sense of empathy should be part and parcel of anything you create. And I think that by default, sensitivity will come along either to your cultural environment, to traditions, to customs, to people's current standing. You know, it's kind of, I think it comes with the territory,
right.
Baseline sensitivities with expressing art. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to consider every single point of sensitivity. In fact, I think we're at a point in time where political correctness is a little out of control, where we're so focused on how someone may feel as opposed to what's actually happening. And that in itself is a dynamic that I find a little scary, to be very honest. Because in order for us to do and achieve and bring better, we need to be honest about our scenarios, and that can sometimes hurt.
Right. Dr. Taimur, do you agree with Rozan's point of view on this? I mean, we are living in a time when there is a quick critique to a lot of things, especially art. Many of it is criticized, especially when we look at photography, for romanticizing poverty in many instances, romanticizing conflict in many instances. How do we battle that line, the cultural sensitivity and political sensitivity, that responsibility that falls on an artist?
Well, first, I wanted to just completely agree with what was said earlier with respect to the culture of political correctness and giving weightage to feelings over and above, weightage to the reality of what is going on in society. So I'm one of those people who thinks that naturally art ought to be provocative and ought to make you think. And so if an artist is constrained within certain barriers and told, well, you can't say this and you can't say that and you can't say this and you can't say that and you can't depict this and you can't depict that, that can be tremendously destructive. But also, having said that, naturally, how could anybody support racist art, or how could anybody support sexist art in this day and age, or how could anybody support art that would galvanize people towards imperialism? So I think the question really is not whether art itself, the sensitivities of art to society, but really the question is one of politics. It's a political question. What is the politics of the artist that we're talking about? Mm-hmm. And if that politics is a politics that's progressive, that seeks to do something for the disenfranchised, for the poor, for the working people, for women, for minorities, et cetera, then it's a worthwhile art. So the question is not really one which can be posed within the framework of art. It's a question that must be posed within the larger framework of politics. There are many things that Pakistanis would find completely insensitive, perhaps, that artists could make or do. And yet,
going back to something that you just mentioned right now, I want to pick up on that because I feel like it's an important point. When you say that it becomes a question of politics, within the realm of politics, who judges the politics of the artist? Because as we were talking previously, much art becomes misconstrued by, of course, the observer or the person who is seeing it. Who gets to judge art ultimately?
Society always gets to judge not just art, but every product of every individual created, within that particular society. So definitely it's going to be society that is the ultimate arbiter of what is progressive and what is reactionary and so on and so forth. But there is also another criteria that we can use, which is the criteria of rationality, the criteria of objectivity, the criteria of science and logic. So when we look at something, we look at whether that has contributed to furthering racism or undermining racism. A similar piece of art can actually have the opposite effect to what an individual may perceive. Right? It depends on the context in which the social context in which that work of art is placed. But the ultimate arbiter of all of these questions has and always will be society. Right. But society must do that, I think, in the light of logic, evidence, science, objectivity, rationality, and so on.
Right. Dr. Rehman, you make a very, very essential point there, and thank you so much for taking out the time and talking to us about this. Rozan, now, one thing that I do want to get to you with the conversation we've had, one word that has come up by the artist we were talking to before and also Dr. Rehman, which was wanting to be provocative, trying to start up a conversation. How do you feel as an artist you are able to do that?
Being honest. It's as simple as that. And also the importance of countering. You mentioned earlier that, how do we address, for example, the glorification of poverty or art that is significantly insulting and when it comes to race or culture or anything. My response to that is simply to counter, to create and put across a point of view that is honest and truthful and counters what is essentially negative, poisonous to society, dangerous to society. It's important for us to respond with a sense of responsibility. Right. So again, it boils down to being honest. It's that simple. And I really feel that we're at a time, as dangerous as it is, in terms of content and information share, people are aware. People understand what is genuine and what isn't. And we need to give credit to humanity a little more. Because this training, this constant training of...
Right. Rozan, sorry, unfortunately, we've run out of time here, but you make a point that is, of course, worthwhile to ponder over, that we're running over time when it comes to content sharing. And, of course, the political dynamics we're living in questions that even more, puts pressure on artists even more. That's, of course, a conversation we're going to have to wait for next time. Thank you so much, Rozan Ahmed, for joining us from London. We're going to go for a short break, but when we return, we discuss the rise in influencer marketing and what does it really take to become an influencer. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. The number of social media influencers is rising and their power is growing. But what really drives companies to seek out this new age ambassadors? And what does it mean to become an influencer? It's an interesting discussion, and joining us for it is Donohoe, who is the CEO of Level Agency and the author of the CEO's Digital Marketing Playbook. He joins us from Charleston. Joining us in the studios is Maheen Farhan, who's a digital marketing expert. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the show. Mr. Thomas Donohoe, let me begin with you. Now, when we're seeing this rise, and market analysts predict that it's going to continue to rise, relying on social media influencers as a marketing tool, what do you think is driving it?
Well, from a digital advertising and digital marketing standpoint, our clients and many, many others are always looking for new, more efficient ways to spend money. Mm-hmm. You have in our industry two giant players, Google and Facebook, and then you've got a half dozen smaller ones. Now, they're still giant companies like LinkedIn, Snapchat, but they're less efficient and they're less ostensibly profitable from an advertiser standpoint. So in our industry, you do have a lot of concentration, a lot of advertising dollars going specifically to Google and Facebook. So advertisers and agencies like ours naturally always want another option. And the influencer channel, if you can call it that, or the marketplace, might offer that in 2020 and going forward.
Right, and of course there's distinct reasons why one channel is preferred to all the others. When we look at past trends, what do you think has been working for these individual influencers, which is of course giving them a popularity boost, but also getting a lot of companies to gravitate towards them?
Sure, from a marketing and advertising standpoint, there are two types. You can break marketing into a few different categories, but there's what's called brand marketing and direct response. Brand marketing is what companies like Coke or Pepsi like to do. They don't need to encourage people to switch their soda choices, but they just deploy billions of dollars every year to consistently get out their message without needing someone to run into the store and buy a Coca-Cola. Direct response is different. Direct response is when you spend money, you expect people to walk into your store to go online and buy something soon. And so influencers have really received a lot of benefit and money from brand advertisers that want popular online personalities and, again, influencers to mention their name and their products. So it's much more about brand marketing than direct response, but we're seeing a little more of the companies in that second category, most of the companies that we represent, starting to test the influencer marketplace.
Right. We're going to get to that a little more about the companies you represent and them testing the waters in this regard. But Maheen, when we're having this conversation, and Mr. Thomas Donohoe, of course, mentioned something interesting, the benefits that these influencers also get. Of course, it's a rise in their popularity, their outreach, and also the money they get. Many people are interested to know what really makes an influencer.
I think that influencer is an opinion leader, basically. They are expert at what they do. For example, if you have a lifestyle blogger or a lifestyle influencer, they are telling you to aspire towards a certain lifestyle, or they have a perfect lifestyle, or they portray to be perfect at least. So like, when brands reach out to these people, they can't just reach out to anyone. If they're selling a certain product, they need to reach out to people who are expert in that certain field. And then, they are also trying to make people believe that this is how you are going to live, or this is the kind of lifestyle that you need to aspire towards.
So when you're talking about a lifestyle, it seems like a full-time investment in your job, trying to, as you're using the word, portray something. What does it really entail when the life of an influencer? What does it really mean, and what does it entail?
I think a lot of times that I have come across influencers, they portray to have a certain lifestyle on social media, and they're trying to promote a certain lifestyle that a normal or an average person cannot have. But it's good for brands because they offer to create content for themselves. So brands don't really have to invest in developing that sort of content. They can already reach out to the influencers' target audience as well. Not just their target audience, they have already developed a number of followers. So, they don't really have to go out and, start marketing from scratch. They can just ask the influencer to create content instead. So it saves a lot of time and a lot of money for for the brands.
Right. Mr. Thomas Donohoe, now, Maheen, of course, says here that these influencers have lifestyles that people don't usually have but would like to aspire towards. Now, my understanding about it has been a little different, and I want to get your take on this as well, that it's the relatability element which allows people to gravitate towards these influencers. What side do you pick and choose, and how do you see this matter?
So I agree with Maheen. The content benefit for corporations to spend money within the influencer marketing channel with influencers, there is a benefit. It does shorten the runway a bit and lower expenses ostensibly in terms of creating new content. But I think the real key is authenticity. Consumers, and this has been a trend for at least 10 years, there comes a point when advertising professionals, marketing agencies like ours, when we create content on behalf of a client, or when the client creates content, it's often two things. One, it's very singular. It's one advertising campaign with the same actors. Number one. Number two, it comes across as inauthentic. And I think one of the benefits, and there are some risks, but the primary benefit is that it's authentic content. And even though many influencers have professional grade cameras and lighting and sound, it's still an authentic, curated experience. And I think that's a big benefit.
Do you think, sorry, Mr. Thomas Donohoe, for interjecting here, but do you think that people don't you think that people are catching up to this idea of authenticity when these are paid content, influencers, marketers? I mean, many a times it says so in their bios, or, from the fact of how they promote the product, people catch on to that.
No, I mean, absolutely. I don't think you're going to get an advertising experience where there is a physical product in someone's hand, whether it's a professional corporate commercial or an influencer with 50,000 followers doing this herself. You're still going to have the aspect of a paid advertisement. So I don't see in this marketplace or in the general marketing ecosystem for that to be eliminated. But again, I go back to the variety and maybe the uniqueness, because that influencer knows his or her audience better than anybody else. And so I would feel that one of the reasons that they got popular in the first place is that they had the right tone or message or cadence to speak to that audience. And I think that's important.
Right. When we're talking about the right tone of speaking to the audience, Maheen, what really resonates with an audience? Now, you observe digital marketing trends and you see what works, what doesn't. When you see the tones and the words, the language, the styles of many of these influencers, what do you feel like is one unique characteristic that is common to all?
I think we have become a very image-obsessed world, you can say, not just country, an image-obsessed world. And then, when people see that, I have not acquired my dream like so-and-so has, and then you perpetuate an image in their mind that, for example, Kim Kardashian just recently promoted this weight loss pill. And, you are just telling your audience to reach out towards a certain standard of beauty or a certain standard of how you look. So at times, sometimes you sell an idea that is too glorified, right, I would say. So I think, but at the same time, relatability is there. A lot of influencers are relatable. They promote authenticity. They promote relatability. And I think being relatable to the mass audience and also being authentic is very important from a digital marketing standpoint, because if your audience knows that you're authentic, then they will follow you. Otherwise, they'll eventually just stop following you, and you won't have that sort of engagement on your Instagram or Facebook.
Mr. Donohoe, now, Maheen gave the example of Kim Kardashian, and we know the world is polarized when it comes to the Kardashian family. Many people like them, many people hate them. Now, when we talk about personalities becoming influencers, is there a risk of the product being conflated with the influencer?
Absolutely. There is a risk, not just in terms of the pairing of the influencer and the product, but to a certain extent, brands are taking a risk by allowing influencers to curate and create content. Now, there are guidelines and there are larger brands try to keep a tighter control, but at the end of the day, this is, again, not shot in a large studio. This is not under direct control of the corporation. So brands are taking a little bit of a risk. But the unique thing is some brands that cannot participate in a lot of the other traditional channels for a few different reasons. They are forced to test markets that can advertise certain products. Here in the United States, the cannabis industry, the marijuana industry, which is very politically charged, Facebook allows some of it. Google won't touch it at all. A lot of these products that are very, very popular, that are making and spending billions of dollars, they need to go into this market because the regulations at this time are much looser.
Right. Mr. Donohoe, when we're talking about the risks that companies take, how are these risks managed and mitigated? If you take a risk in dipping into an influencer's popularity, how is that risk balanced off? How do companies do it?
Sure. Well, primarily they'll use agencies like ours. So we're the intermediary. We're the pipeline of both spending a brand's, a company's money, marketing budget, but it's our responsibility to police and help curate and help make the messages consistent and profitable. So primarily they do need to rely on an agency like ours. How we do that is there is quite a bit of due diligence. There are a handful of marketplaces. A lot of those are born here in the United States, and they are starting to gain traction internationally. But there are marketplaces where there are thousands and thousands of influencers that set up profiles similar to a social network. And these marketplaces attract companies like mine, and we ostensibly shop for influencers. And there's a lot of research that goes into it. We do absolutely make sure that we do some background checks, that their numbers, their followers, and their engagement rates are good enough that we want to take the risk. And obviously there's the price tag. So there's some due diligence involved.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Thomas Donohoe, for taking out the time and talking to us from Charleston, giving us your insight into all of this. Maheen, now, when we're talking about future predictions, how do you think this trend is unfolding, and how do you think more creative ideas are coming into the market in dealing and experimenting with different social media platforms? What do you see happening?
I think that even from a traditional marketing standpoint, you can say that, for centuries we have related to that attractive character. So many brands have used that one person who is selling that product. You could take example of KFC, Subway. They all have this one person who is selling that product. So, people relate to humans more. So I think it has a very good future, but, we need to really investigate who is authentic and who is not. Like Thomas mentioned that, he checks engagements, he checks the number of followers people have. At times people are also hiring bots, and then they have fake followers. And, that's not authentic. And at the same time, you're fooling the mass audience who's following you. And then you're also fooling the brands who would most likely work with you in the future.
Right. Maheen, that's one of the interesting points in this discussion, organic and inorganic popularity. True. Can you give us a sense of how people create an organic popularity?
I have always advocated the importance of organic followers, because when you have robots, they're not going to engage with whatever content that you're producing. So you have to, for example, you post a picture and then you create a caption. So your caption has to be something that people relate to, because the visuals are there. You can work a lot on your visuals. But personally, I feel that whatever you write or whatever you support, it's like you're a brand ambassador of your own self. So, you have to be very careful with that. You should try to use that and take it as a social responsibility that reaches out to mass audience, and you tell them that, this is the kind of life that you aspire to with. For example, I blog about inexpensive things. I support not just using branded clothes. I support using every type of, all the type of brands that you can have and afford. And, when you portray a certain lifestyle or a certain type of brand that is expensive to the point that your followers cannot buy, ultimately they'll not resonate with the content that you're producing.
Right. That's, of course, an essential thing. How content is supposed to resonate with the audience and the importance of that. Thank you so much, Maheen, for coming down to the studios, joining us and giving us some insight into how all of this works. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.